All right, babies, are we ready? Yalla. Risk analysis management. As if, wow. Huh. Yeah, I did imagine about like 5-6 pages. This is cool. Okay. What's the purpose? Risk analysis and management identifies area of uncertainty that could negatively affect value. Analyzes and evaluates. Exactly, okay, so you're analyzing areas of uncertainty that would negatively affect value, analyzes and evaluates those uncertainties, and develops and manages ways to dealing with risks. Kind of simple, right? What's the description? Failure to identify, manage risks may negatively affect the value of a solution. Risk analysis and management involves identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risks where sufficient controls are not ready in place. Business analysts develop plans of avoiding, reducing, or modifying the risks. When necessary, implementing these plans. Risk management is an ongoing activity, continuous consultation and communication with stakeholders, because you never know where risk comes out, right? Okay. What are the elements? You identify the risk, you analyze the fucking risk, and you evaluate the risk, and then you treat the risk, right? And ultimately, that's it. Start with identification. Risks are discovered and identified through a combination of expert judgment, stakeholder input, experimentation, past experiences, historical analysis, similar initiative and solutions. The goal is to identify a comprehensive set of relevant risks to minimize the unknowns. Yeah, are you with me? Yeah, you're with me. Risk identification is an ongoing activity. The risk event could be one occurrence, several occurrences, non-occurrence. A risk condition could be one condition or a combination of conditions or event or condition that may have several consequences. And one consequence may be caused by several different events or conditions. Each risk can be described in a risk register that supports the analysis of those risks and plans for addressing them. If the union does not agree with changes to the job descriptions, for example, they're giving us a risk register, what's the consequence? And then after that, what's the probability? What's the impact? What's the risk level? And what's the plan in case it happens? And what's who's in charge? And basically, what's left after it's handled? And they're basically kind of like, if the union does not agree with changes to job descriptions, they plan staff changes will not be able to occur. Begin consultations with the union no later than next month. Blah, 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 blah. What about analysis? Analysis of a risk involves understanding the risk, estimating the level of risk. Sometimes controls may be already in the place to deal with some risks, and these would be taken into account when analyzing the risk. But that's not always the case. Why? Because new risks come with different understandings, or at the very least, you can't apply the same analysis you did on something before, because most probably shit has changed. And the likelihood of occurrence would be expressed either on as a probability or a numerical scale, with values such as low, medium, and high. Yeah, because you're not comparing. You can't use percentage, right? You're not really comparing what's going on. The consequences of risk are described in terms of their impact on the potential value. The impact of any risk described is basically in terms of cost, duration, solution scope, solution quality, and any other factor, blah, 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 blah. Here's the risk impact scale. Low impact, minor areas of scope are affected. Minor quality problems, less than 1% cost impact. Medium impact is basically like 3%. High impact, more than 3%. 10% extra days effort. Duration, the effort is also resources, right? That's how they're splitting it, right? And again, regarding any solution you do in every project you're doing, it's operating in different structures and systems within society. So you don't necessarily have that kind of you always have to be the one creating these from scratch, because you don't know what you're interacting with. It's not like you're taking something that already works and you're working through it. You're building something new. While an enterprise may have standard or a baseline risk impact scale, the categories like cost, effort, and reputation and threshold may be adjusted to consider the potential value and level of risk that is acceptable. Typically 3 or 5 broad categories of levels are used to describe how to interpret the potential impact. And the level of given risk may be expressed as a function of the probability of occurrence and an impact. In many cases, it is simple multiplication of probability and impact. So like, okay, so because we're splitting it into different pieces, then each piece kind of like has its own contribution. And ultimately, you can add them all up to kind of see the bigger impact of everything else, especially when you're objectifying them. No. When your approach is quantified, you're trying to quantify the approach. And then you evaluate the risk. The risk analysis results are compared with the potential value of the change or the solution to determine the level of the risk, acceptable or not. An overall risk level may determine adding up to the individual risks. Like so, again, like some risks are handled based on quantity versus quality. Something social is riskier from a social perspective, not from a small. From a social perspective, not from a business or an economic perspective. Yes, social versus economic, because economic follows the numbers, social follows the feelings. Okay. Treatment, some risks may be acceptable, but for other risks, it may be necessary to take measures to reduce the risk. One or more approaches for dealing with risk may be considered, and a combination of approaches could be used to address a risk. Avoid, either the source of the risk is removed, the plans are adjusted to ensure that the risk does not occur. Transfer, the liability of dealing with risk is moved to or shared with the third party. Reduce the probability of the risk, mitigate, so you avoid the risk, you transfer it to something else, you mitigate it through kind of like negotiating something, you accept it and you go with it, and you kind of like set up, if that happens, this is what we do. A workaround would be developed. Or we increase the risk, you decide to take on more to pursue an opportunity, because like who the fuck cares? I want to do what I want and nobody can tell me what to do. I'm a grown-ass man. Once the approach for dealing with specific risk is selected, a risk response plan is developed and assigned to risk owner with responsibility and authority for that risk. In that case, risk avoidance, the risk owner takes steps to ensure that the probability or the impact of the risk is reduced to nil. And for those risks we cannot reduce to nil, the risk owner is responsible for monitoring the risk and for implementing a risk mitigation plan. The risk is reanalyzed to determine the residual risk, which is the new probability, and impact as a result of measures taken to modify the risk. Anytime you're treating something, you have to look at the end result of it, and the goal is to bring the risk down to zero, but let's face it, that's almost never the case. So there could be a cost-benefit analysis done to determine if cost and effort of the measures reduced to the level of risk are enough to make it worthwhile. Maybe you spend $500 in order for you to save $5. That's not necessarily something that's smart. Sometimes you take the risk just because it makes sense, right? And the risks may be evaluated in terms of residual risk, stakeholder, and again, like, I don't know, it's like you get to decide which work do you want to do, and after a while you go like, okay, I did it, and then what? Stakeholders should be informed of other plans of modifying the risks, always. And what are the usage considerations? Well, can be strengths, it can be applied to strategic risks would affect long-term value of the enterprise. Tactical risks will affect value of a change, and operational risks which affect the value of a solution once the change is made. An organization typically faces similar challenges on many of its initiatives. The successful risk responses on one initiative can be useful lessons learned for other initiatives. The risk level of a change or a solution could vary over time. Ongoing risk management helps to recognize that variation and to evaluate the risks and sustainability of the planned responses. And what are the limitations? Here, this one. Ongoing risk management is basically what we're highlighting here, right? It helps to reorganize the variation, to evaluate the risks. So yeah, what are the limitations? Number of possible risks. Most initiatives can easily become unmanageably large. It may only be possible to manage a subset of potential risks. There's a possibility that significant risks are not identified. Yes, because to find risks, we have to ask questions beyond ourselves, or at the very least, we have to look at whatever we're working on beyond what we already are used to looking at. So like, it's a very strong skill to remove yourself from the equation in order for you to see things a bit more clearly. That's it. I love you guys, and next we have roles and permissions. Matrix. Yay.